Okay, confession time. I've never been a fan of gouache. Every time someone's asked me about gouache here on the channel, I've kind of dodged the question. Why? Because every time I've tried painting with gouache, I ended up frustrated and honestly a little bit mad at my painting. But today I'm giving it one more shot. After years of avoiding gouache, I'm pulling out my paints and attempting a portrait to see if I can finally fall in love with this medium that so many people rave about. So why do I hate gouache so much? Well, for starters, it dries super fast, which many artists love, but I think I wanted it to act more like oils, creamy, slow drying, easy to push around, fix mistakes. But instead, it dries really quickly and then re-wets in unexpected ways, turning my layers into blotchy chaos. And honestly, I was treating it like watercolor, and that doesn't always work. But I'm determined to change my mind, so stick around as I try to paint a gouache portrait and find out whether this is the day I finally make peace with gouache or give it up for good. Let's talk supplies because this might be a factor that finally helps me like gouache. When I first tried gouache years ago, I was using some old Winsor & Newton designer's gouache I'd had sitting in a drawer forever. Honestly, it was probably kind of dried out and goopy and definitely on the more affordable end of the spectrum. That might explain why I struggled so much with chalky layers and blotchy coverage. This time around, I'm upgrading to the Schmincke gouache, which is a higher-end artist-grade brand. The colors feel creamier, they're more pigmented, and supposedly they re-wet more smoothly. Could better paint quality finally change my gouache experience? We're about to find out. For brushes, I'm using some beautiful Silver Silk 88 brushes. They're super versatile and hold a good point, which helps with detailed portrait work. And my paper is the Etchr Perfect Sketchbook. I love it because it's thick enough to handle multiple layers and a bit of water without buckling or pilling, which is really crucial when you're experimenting with the quirks and unpredictability of water media. For today's portrait, I'm using a photo reference from Broadcasting Brushers. It's this beautiful double portrait pose of a husband and wife that has some interesting light and shadow and beautiful colors. I'm excited to tackle that. Now let's talk about a few advantages of gouache that might help me fall in love with it this time. The first advantage is that your sketch underneath doesn't have to be perfect. Gouache is opaque, so it can cover up messy pencil lines or early mistakes, giving you more forgiveness as you go. Advantage number 2 is that you can focus on one little section at a time and layer creamy strokes of color to slowly build up dimension and detail. It's quite a bit different from watercolor, where you often have to plan big washes over the whole piece. The third advantage is if your colors turn out too dark or intense, you can actually lighten them by mixing in white paint. Imagine that. That's a game changer for adjusting skin tones or highlights in portraits. And a fourth advantage is that even though gouache is opaque, you can still achieve some gorgeous watercolor effects by diluting it with water. Think soft gradients, delicate washes, and subtle textures that add so much character to your painting. Plus, you can still paint around your whites if you want to preserve bright highlights. So, armed with better supplies and a fresh perspective, I'm ready to give gouache another chance. Let's see if I can finally make peace with this paint.
So let's jump into this double portrait. The colors I squeezed out on my palette are titanium white, lemon yellow, cadmium red hue, madder lake deep, ultramarine deep, titanium gold ochre, burnt sienna, and ivory black. So I started out with this kind of angled chisel brush, and you can see that my first brush strokes are a little bit hesitant. I wasn't really sure how the paint was going to react to the paper, how they were going to mix. And you can see I went a little bit dark too soon. I started with some dark pinks, so I had to try to mix in quite a bit of white to lighten that up. I was struggling with my colors just generally being too dark. And blending, of course, was a little bit of an issue, since normally when I blend skin tones and watercolor, I use the wet and wet technique and the colors merge naturally on the paper. But this is a little bit more like oil or acrylic. You have to actually soften and blend with the brush while the paint is still wet. So timing-wise, I was struggling a little bit here. But as I continued to work, I was starting to get more of a hang of it. And as long as I worked section by section, one little piece of the puzzle at a time, adjusting my colors and my values as best I could based on the reference photo, I was starting to see some progress and actually beginning to enjoy the process. For that gray hair, I just used a light wash of white tinged with a little bit of that black. And then along the shadow side of the face, you can see I started to introduce a little bit more of that madder lake deep and some burnt sienna. And I did use my ivory black for the dark features. I found it actually a little bit cathartic to work with some black paint. Normally I mix my blacks with watercolor using usually a brown and a dark blue. But in this case, it was so nice to just use the convenient pure black that was already right there on my palette. And I thought it looked great. It didn't look too murky or anything. Gouache in general, because it is opaque, you don't have to worry about overdoing it necessarily or overworking. It's not going to be the same situation as with watercolor, where you can potentially overwork an area by trying to do too much layering. In this case, I felt like I could layer and layer as much as I wanted. You don't want to go too thick, that said, because it can flake off when it's dry if you have chunky paint on there. So it's kind of an interesting balance of the paint needing to be thin enough so that it's not going to flake off or get chunky, but also thick enough so that you can layer over the top without washing out or reactivating the paint underneath. So you can see here on the cheeks, I was struggling with using too thin of washes, and it was just sort of reactivating the paint a little bit. And instead of laying down color, I was almost lifting the color underneath, which was a problem. So I had to really start to figure out the consistency that I needed to get the best results. And definitely it's going to take me a few more practice runs to figure it out. Right there in the forehead, you can see it was just a little too wet. And another difference between gouache and watercolor that I quickly discovered is that the light colors, the white, your light yellow, things like that, they actually dry darker, especially if you use thinner washes. So kind of the opposite, watercolor dries lighter. Now, I did some fun watercolor style washes in the background using my ultramarine deep and a little hint of the yellow in there. And I love how these Schmincke colors just granulate. They look so beautiful on this Etchr paper. And when I went ahead and started the wife here in the scene and started with the black hair, tried to leave some negative space where the brighter highlights are. I found that it was almost easier just to leave the white of the paper just like I would with watercolor rather than use chunky, thick white paint. As I was working on the wife's skin tones over here, I made an effort to make my skin tones a little bit lighter and not quite so aggressively dark and red, although I wasn't too unhappy with how the husband turned out. But you can see I was carefully trying to alternate between warms and cools based on what I'm seeing in the photo, and introducing hints of blue in there on the left side of the face to just cool down those shadows and help them appear to turn backward in space. And again, I was working in little sections just like I did on the first portrait. And I found that that was really a pretty simple way to work as long as I had a decent sketch underneath. But like I said at the beginning, even if the sketch wasn't perfect, you can always adjust your drawing with the paint later. Because the paint is opaque, you can just lay it over the top and redraw as needed with your brush strokes. So no worries there if your sketch isn't perfect. You can always modify and adjust with your paint later. Here I switched to a round brush. This is another Silver Slick 88 round brush. I think it's a size 8. I actually used this for almost the whole rest of the portrait. I really liked this brush a lot. I mean, round brushes are my go-to anyway with watercolor, but this one was just a joy to work with. As I built up the layers of the face, I was feeling more and more confident adding in those dark details. She was looking a little bit rough here at the beginning. Just like with watercolors, I think gouache paintings can go through quite an ugly phase. You just have to be patient, see it through to the end, and not give up on your painting. Although there were definitely some moments in this one that I wanted to just throw in the towel and give it up. But I'm glad I kept going. I'm glad I pushed through. I was definitely feeling some frustration again with the handling and the layering of the paint. But in general, the Schmincke paint really just performed so much better than my other previous experiences with gouache. So that made a huge difference in the enjoyment of this whole painting process. I continued to add some more fine details to those facial features. And then when I got to the blue top and scarf, this was probably my favorite part to paint in the whole thing. It was such a joy to use a little bit more water in the mix, more like watercolor. I threw in some white in there as well, but just to work with loose brush strokes and to see what happens when I splash that color around a bit. Now, when I added the bangs here, I thought they looked a little bit too spidery or wispy, and I lost some of those highlights in the forehead. So this is where using your white paint and just kind of layering over the top and starting over is a huge advantage in gouache. If I had done this in watercolor, that would have been it. I would have had to just deal with it and leave it alone. But here I was able to actually cover up the forehead again with lighter tones and then try those bangs again a second time. So that was a real big advantage with the gouache, I found. Here I added some more highlights to that right cheek and mouth area and lightened up the anatomy a little bit. And I think that helped a lot. And then for the hand here on the right side, I made this really loose and painterly, not much detail at all. I wanted the faces to be the sole focus. I did add some more color here to the right side to balance out the composition, and just a few final details to these features. Well, there's the finished painting with the scarf complete and that loose washy background. I was super happy with how this turned out. In fact, I even took my gouache paints with me to one of my Wednesday night figure painting sessions and tried again with this portrait. And again, I was really happy with the results. It's funny how, regardless of the medium you use, your paintings are gonna look like your own paintings. So here, this one ended up looking like most of my other watercolors after all. You could hardly tell that it's gouache. I think my mind has been changed and I'm really enjoying gouache, and I actually can't wait to try it some more and experiment some more. There are no tutorials on this because I'm still in that experimental phase, but maybe in the future as I continue to grow and gain confidence in this medium, I'll be able to teach gouache someday too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.